I come from a working class family who voted Tory, and so I used to spend my entire adolescence, hating, probably calling my mum, and grandparents Tory scum, So, as I said, I get that, but I kind of grew out of that, which is because you do.
Hello and welcome to Offscript. My name is Steven Edginton. In recent years, woke activists have held immense power in these culture wars. They've got people fired, deplatformed, and changed the terms of debate surrounding women and feminism. Suzanne Moore has been a victim of cancel culture and will today be talking to me about trans activism and the state of the Labour Party. Do only women have cervixes?
Oh, that's a good question to start off with, isn't it? Yes, I think only people with female biology have cervixes, so that's women. And people who identify as trans men have cervixes, but that's because they have female biology. So I think on the whole, for most people, the understanding is that only women have cervixes. But if women want to define themselves in a different way, that's up to them.
Why couldn't Keir Starmer admit to that fact?
My feeling on all this is that many of these sort of pronouncements that were made by people like Keir Starmer and people in the Labour Party are just an attempt to adhere to the ideology that they think is fashionable, and that they actually haven't really bothered to research it very well, to understand the issues, or to consider the voices of many of their own supporters and women in the party who are not happy with some of the compromises that would need to be made. And I think people wanted a clear direction from Starmer, and they just didn't get one. And he and Lammy and Barry Gardner and all of them ended up looking absolutely sort of ridiculous, I think.
Do you think he'd prepared for that question? Do you think he was coming up with that answer on the fly?
Well, it felt like it was on the fly because he said it was a thing. He didn't really say yes or no, did he? He said it's a thing that shouldn't be said, as though it was somehow illegal to say what is basically a statement of fact or reality or medical science or any of these things that are now apparently in question. He should have been much better prepared because Ed Davey had been asked it the week before, hadn't he, by Andrew Marr. So I don't think that people realise how much... It's not that people are particularly invested in the trans debate, because most people are fairly liberal about how people want to live their lives. But I do think a lot of people, and I count myself as one of them, but I do think a lot of people are very concerned about how this affects women's rights, and especially in the Labour Party, which are meant to be a party that has fought for women's rights and trade union rights and maternity leave and all these things. So he should have been much better prepared for it. And I don't think they understand the strength of feeling that there is amongst their own supporters about this issue. And then David Lammy said, this is an issue that never comes up on the doorstep. And immediately people who'd been out with him campaigning said that wasn't the case.
You've been a journalist for a long time. You've been a columnist.
Forever.
Forever. Well, there you go. You know the importance of language. And this debate is essentially around language, isn't it? And there's other terms they use. They talk about birthing people. What is this manipulation or sort of campaign to change the language that we use? What's the impact of that?
Well, anybody who knows anything about language knows that it changes. Now we talk about gay people, and most people are happy to do that. So I don't think it's about, a few group of sort of bolshy feminists subjecting to a change in language. What the difficulty is that no one feels that they've been consulted about this change in language. So I am suddenly supposed to call myself a cis woman and use pronouns that say she, her, for the benefit of who? There's, the estimates at the moment are about 1% of the population may be trans. It might be 500,000 people in the country. It might be more, more people are certainly identifying in that way. But why should more than half the population suddenly have to change how they speak about themselves? And also, some of us feel, I think, that we are being kind of, language is very powerful. I mean, reclaiming language and naming yourself and naming your own experiences has been part of the freedoms that women have now and the liberation of women. So when people talk about erasure, they mean if you cannot, for instance, say the word mother and you have to say the word birthing parent or something, that you lose a whole kind of identity and part of women's history. So I noticed that when some of the newspapers were talking about, for instance, the changes in abortion law in Texas that make it virtually impossible to have an abortion, they were talking again about birthing pregnant people. And, pregnant people are women, and this is a law that affects women, and we should just be able to use that word. And I think there are a lot of trans people out there as well who would, go along with or be quite happy to just be included by saying, women and non-binary people, or women and, transgender people. You can do both. But the strange thing that's happening at the moment is all of this language, which is, we're told, is about inclusivity, is actually excluding half the population. So something very straight, it's a bit sort of doublethink, Orwellian doublethink, I think. And yet many institutions now have completely gone along with it.
Well, it's interesting because trans activists would argue that by using this language, as you say, it's exclusionary to them. And they would some even argue that by not using proper ways to describe trans people, that they are being put at risk somehow, or that they feel unsafe because of this language. How do you come back to that? And if someone's saying to you, you're making me feel unsafe, or you're sort of trying to erode my existence or something, how do you argue against that?
I find this argument really, really peculiar because, the idea, somehow we've moved. I think the idea has come a lot from campuses in America, actually. But the idea that, say, somebody in another building using a word that you don't particularly like can actually make you feel violated or unsafe. And I find it really strange that we're having this discussion at a time when we are really, at the moment, horribly aware of how unsafe women are because of the awful murders of Sarah Everard and Sabina Ness. And, our front pages have literally been full of pictures of murdered women, or, horrible stories of abuse and so on. So I don't believe, as some trans activists seem to believe, not all, but some, that words are, as they call them, literal violence. I think literal violence is, an act. I don't think words are something that, I think they can be hurtful. Of course I do. I know they are. I know that. But I think the issue is that we're trying to kind of all get along, and some people are saying, look, this is my reality, and if you don't adhere to my reality, you are making me feel very, very not only uncomfortable, but you're putting my life in danger. And I think that's an exaggeration, a complete exaggeration. And certainly in the case of there's hate crime against trans people and gay people, and certainly against women, although against women there's no definition of hate crime. Misogyny is not a hate crime. So people are protected in certain ways, and I don't underestimate how difficult it is to be trans. And I'm sure you must get a lot of there's a lot of abuse and discrimination and all of those things. I totally accept that. But the statistics that are bandied about by trans activists, when you actually drill down, are a kind of emotional blackmail sometimes, because I think last year there was a Trans Day of Remembrance. A lot of celebrities got involved. Well, I mean, we have 2 or 3 women being killed a week. I mean, it went up in the pandemic, being murdered, usually, nearly always by their so-called partners. And no trans person in the last couple of years has been killed in this country. Thankfully, thank God, So the figures on trans people always being the most marginalised and so on are really coming from places like Brazil, where a lot of trans people are involved in sex work and have really terrible, terrible lives and are at real risk of violence and, murder. But we're just not in that situation here. And I don't think we need any of us to kind of up the situation. Many, many people going through puberty are having a really difficult time, especially young girls. And that's what we've seen at places like the Tavistock, that the number of referrals to the Tavistock was always, boys who felt uncomfortable and wanted to transition, and now it's shot up, like sort of, a huge increase to girls. And girls are just saying, I suppose, I am really uncomfortable in my body in becoming an adult woman, and there may be several answers to that, and one may be for them to transition, but there may be other ways. Certainly other countries like Sweden are kind of going down a different path.
There's so much to unpack there, and as you say quite rightly, it's a hugely nuanced and complex issue. And the point about, by using this language of, you are making me feel unsafe, you're putting my life in danger, you're not recognising my existence, isn't the point of that language to shut you down and to censor you?
Yes, I think it is to shut you down very much. And I also think it's a massive deflection on where the real problems lie. Who discriminates and murders and is violent and makes threats to trans people? It's not feminists. Who kills women? It's not feminists. I mean, the issue lies with male violence, and that's a really, that's the thing we never really talk about. So somehow, to be identified as a TERF or someone who's not going along with this ideology, you then become the enemy. And yet the threat, I mean, obviously I've had loads and loads of threats for my stance, but just, this isn't about me, but look at anybody could look at what happened to J.K. Rowling, for instance, who wrote what I consider to be a fairly reasonable, reasoned essay about her feelings, and why she had these feelings, and, the absolute kind of level of vitriol and abuse and death threats and bomb threats and rape threats that appeared on Twitter is unbelievable. I mean, it's just horrific, really. So who is safe and who isn't safe is a really good question, because I want trans people to feel safe. Of course I do. But I also want women to feel safe. And isn't that, that's the point that we need to get to. But it's become, the debate, as you know, has become so incredibly polarised that people are actually scared now to say anything, really, because possibly they're working in an institution where they may lose their job, or they will just be kind of cast out. And I see it as a kind of faith, and you become a heretic, and it's just not a faith I share. And normally, in life. I mean, I have friends who are religious, for instance. They know that I'm not, but they don't demand that I share their religion. It's kind of a bit live and let live, and I feel the same way about this. I can totally, and I have trans friends, I always have had. I totally accept that this is the way that they want to live, but I don't have to believe that I can no longer refer to myself as a mother, or I'm simply a menstruator or a cervix haver. I still think these words are mine to use, and I think they've been very important. I think one of the things that feminism has achieved is, over the last in my lifetime, is things that women didn't used to talk about except with each other, like whether it's periods or giving birth or the menopause, the physical things that we were all meant to be terribly ashamed of. We talk about a bit more now, and it's been important, really important for us to be able to do that. And so, these specifically female experiences matter. And the other thing is, if you're interested, or if you're on the left, or even if you're a liberal, I would say, or just somebody who cares about the whole kind of global situation, there are many, many places in the world where there is no way that your biology doesn't determine your destiny. I mean, try identifying your way out of being a woman in Afghanistan right now, or or in the Congo, or in Eritrea. So this is a very kind of privileged discussion to be having, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I want to talk about your experiences of being on the receiving end of these activists. And I think, although it's been incredibly unpleasant for you, it must have been at the same time interesting as someone, I'm sure you are, who's intellectually curious, to experience what it's like to be like on the end of a sort of radical, what I think is a radical ideology. And that's what you talked about religion, that's what ideologies do to people, isn't it? And just sticking on this cervix issue as well, just one more question on that, because it's so important. One of the other threats to women is cancer, cervical cancer. And can you talk about the kind of the impact this debate has on women not getting screened for this cancer, especially with COVID and the lockdowns? We've seen a huge amount of people not going to get checked for lumps and things like that. So can you talk about the impact of that?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, because that's just a really kind of pragmatic point about this stuff. When I go to my doctors, for instance, on the wall, telling women to go for cervical smears is written in about 3 or 4 different languages, because lots of people where I live speak different languages, and they are really not going to identify with the word cervix havers. They just aren't. So all communication, health communication, has to be clear. All health professionals know that, and already only 1 in 3 women are going for their regular tests, and that's really kind of heartbreaking, because this is one of the cancers that, if caught early, really is not a problem. It really isn't. And several of my friends had bad smear tests, had some treatment years ago, never another issue. But if it is left untreated, it is serious. So women are already not going. Women whose first language is not English will not understand this kind of new hip, cervix haver business. Women are already often ashamed when you ask them why they won't go for a smear test. There are all sorts of reasons, and sometimes they only want a woman doctor, or sometimes they just feel a lot of shame about such a kind of intimate procedure, and the job of we should encourage that as much as we should encourage women to check for lumps in their breasts and so on, and all of these things. It was interestingly, I don't even think this could happen now, and I wasn't a supporter of her, but Theresa May, who stood up in Parliament and said, we've got an issue here and we need to sort this out. And the idea that we now can't sort of speak about it, or we have to speak about it in a way that the average person won't hear or can't understand, is a step backwards, surely. So yes, it's really important, and I think it was clear, watching the fallout from the Labour Party conference, that a lot of these guys don't really know what a cervix is either. I mean, I felt it really mad. I mean, really crazy. And then that trans woman, India Willoughby, offered to show hers to Andrew Marr. Well, that's amazing, because you can have all sorts of things done to yourself, and she has, but I'm sure, good luck to her, but she hasn't got a cervix. You can't have a cervix transplant when they reconstruct a vagina out of a penis. I mean, I'm sorry, the cervix bit isn't there. And that's the other thing. I think people should just be, anybody who wants hormones or surgery and to go through these procedures, I think we have to have an honesty about what they are, what they do, where they work, where they don't work, what the risks are, and whether people are fulfilled by these things. Because right now we have, there are people who've transitioned and it's absolutely the right thing to do. It's made them feel at one with themselves and they go on to have great lives. But there are also people who really regret what they've done and feel that they didn't have enough, perhaps, therapy or understanding before they went forward for these things. And I think we just have to have a much more kind of honest talk about it. But even saying that is seen as somehow anti-trans, or trying to stop trans people being happy or existing. And I mean, the thing that is said to me and to people like me is, our lives are not up for debate. We exist. Well, of course. I mean, I'm not denying anybody's existence, but I am concerned about, in fact, like my sort of big issue isn't really trans people. My issue is to protect the rights that women already have, and to make sure that especially young teenagers or teenage girls are not sent down a medical pathway that they come to regret later.
I'm just curious to know whether you think you would be able to have this discussion at your former newspaper.
Which particular bit of it?
All of the stuff we've talked about in the last 20 minutes or so. Do you think would The Guardian have enabled such an interview? Maybe they would, I don't know.
Well, not with me, no. I mean, I wasn't the only person at that newspaper unhappy with the direction. I mean, many, many, many people were. But people are also, we were going into COVID, people are worried about their jobs. People really are scared to speak up, because if you look at the people who speak up and look at what happens to them. And I'm not saying this out of self-pity, because I'm fine. I'm at the Telegraph. I'm happy. I'm doing my thing. I can, I'm able to say what I want to say, that's always been like really important to me. Really more than kind of where I say it. And so I'm fine. And I'm sure J.K. Rowling, although that's been really, really tough for her, is kind of fine. But who I worry about is like people who approach me in the street, or I know, who are something like a teaching assistant in a primary school, and some little boy has put a skirt on and they've thought that was fine, but somebody else has whisked them off to see if they have kind of gender dysphoria. Whereas I would be very much, kids just like, kids play in all sorts of ways and just leave it, But they can't speak up because they feel that they will be branded as transphobic and they could possibly lose their jobs. I mean, since all this fuss happened to me, the number of emails and letters I get from people who are very concerned about the direction some of this stuff is going in is big, and it can be from, like, I'm quite shocked sometimes. I mean, it can be from consultants from I can't say, I can never say this word, doctors who deal with hormones, well, do you know what I mean?
Oh God, yeah, we know what you mean.
Endocrinologists, I think it is. Anyway, I can never say it, but so you've got consultants writing, saying, you know, that they're not allowed to use the word male and female, and yet their whole thing is sorting out hormones, and midwives and many people sort of just concerned about how they are meant to address people, and because that's another part of the trans ideology, isn't it? This thing that sex is assigned at birth, which is I mean, I've got 3 children. Sex is not randomly assigned at birth. You can assign sex in a fetal scan at 12 weeks. Actually, if you want to, you can do it privately about 6 or 7 weeks. And I know this because I've done stories where there's been, I've been to parts of the world where there is sex selection, i.e. they abort female fetuses. You know, there's quite a lot, quite a few places in the world where that happens. And of course it happens because they have assigned sex in the womb very, very early on. And so some of this language that we're now meant to accept, I find quite difficult to accept. And I think there's a real blurring between the idea of sex, which is, for me, biological, biological reality, and gender, which is the social construct that we learn, and some of us are more or less masculine or fit into those roles, or not, you know. But you know, the idea that a midwife, you know, that you have a baby and you go, oh, what do you reckon it is then? And someone randomly comes along and says, I think I was talking to a doctor the other day, and they just said, you know, at the moment, you know, as soon as a baby is born, it's observed, just as the baby is observed, and yes, it is decided by genitals, and it's the first thing people always ask, isn't it? Is it a boy or a girl? And that's just one of the observations. Another is they weigh it and they measure the head circumference. It's a series of observations, and it's just the standard procedure. But the first thing people always say is, it a boy or a girl? And it is not this. There are very, very, very tiny number of cases where people are intersex, and that's, you know, really difficult conversations for doctors to then have with parents about what they're going to do. But this is like, we're talking about sort of 0.01% or something. But yeah.
There is an argument to say that historically the Conservatives, and I don't mean the party but the ideological sort of movement, have been the sort of Puritans, the people who have restricted freedom of speech, the people who have wanted to sort of be very socially conservative when talking about matters of, let's say, gay people or whatever it is. And as religion has kind of declined in Britain and in the West, and as the socially liberal movements were so successful in the United States and in Britain during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we had this huge sexual liberation and I would say revolution within society. Britain has changed so much in a very short period of time in terms of who is dominant in cultural elites. Is it a coincidence that you are now writing for the Daily Telegraph and not the Guardian? And with that context of cultural elites flipping, and now the new Puritans are perhaps those on the left?
I mean, it's very disturbing. It's very disturbing that it is the left on the whole, that has embraced what I see as a very kind of retrograde ideology for women, because I would hope that we would be liberated from gender, so people can be whatever they want to be without having to have really risky operations or being on hormones for the rest of their lives. So, I mean, the feminist argument is to sort of break down the gender stereotypes, but unfortunately some of the trans, not all, but some of the trans activists seem to be totally reinforcing those stereotypes. And I see it very much as part of a kind of generalised backlash against women and women's rights and feminism, in fact. The thing that disturbs me is, I guess I always imagined it would come much more from the right, and it's coming from, so I would say a lot of this stuff is coming from the left, and it's misogyny, just good old-fashioned misogyny, but it's disguised in this, I'm such a good person because I just love all trans people. When you talk to these people, they've never actually met a person. They don't really know the arguments, but it's just like, it's a sort of way of signalling that they're just a really great, good modern person. And it's just a way to kind of slag off women. And that's what that's the kind of fight, that's the kind of argument. I've been quite cheered up recently though, because I've been to a couple of meetings, and we are always told that this is a generational issue, and it's just like old sort of crones like me, you know, old school feminists who think this, and all young women are totally on board with it. And I've been to a few quite big meetings, and there was a real mix of ages, and certainly it's quite difficult for young women, especially students, to even question any of this stuff. So I don't think it's quite as sort of cut and dry as people make out, really, on the generational thing. But I worry, of course, because when we see what's being taught in universities, and I don't know if we're going to talk about, say, what's happening today with Katherine Stock, it's really, it's really McCarthyite.
Well, why don't you give readers, or viewers rather, a bit of an idea of what did happen? So this is at the University of Sussex, and they finally have, put out a statement saying, defending this lecturer. So can you give people an idea? This is just one example of many of what happened.
Well, Katherine Stock is a professor of philosophy at Sussex, well respected. Her last book was called Material Girls, and it was an argument about, really she takes us through the history of how trans ideology became to be what it is. And she is, she basically thinks that people actually can't change sex, and she says that, really, and that this is a kind of fiction that we have all bought into. But she makes, she's a philosopher, she goes through the history and the arguments of this. In real life, she's, quietly spoken, sort of, a professor of philosophy, and she happens to be gay, and so she's not somebody who's gender conforming, as we're all, that's the worst possible thing to be. So, but this latest row, so her life has basically been made hell for the last few years, because students have complained about her, saying that her lectures, which are really, her lectures are higher philosophy. But the presence of her and her lectures makes them feel unsafe. And these are students who are not even doing her course, have complained about her. So her life has been made difficult by that. But what's really disturbing is also some of her colleagues have complained about her. And you would imagine that there would be a sort of academic solidarity even if you don't agree with people, that you would have some solidarity with your colleagues, but no. And it's resulted in now really proper, I would say, real intimidation. They were setting off flares. They want her fired. They set up I imagine it's a small number of people have set up an Instagram account where they just want her fired. And again, some of her colleagues have gone along with this. And finally, the university has come out with quite a strong statement in support of academic freedom. But it's almost taken years for it to do that. This has been going on for some time. It's been going on at Bristol. It's been going on in several universities. It's not just, it happens obviously to lecturers. Selena Todd at Oxford, who's a professor of working class history, has to walk around with security guards. Rosario Sanchez at Bristol couldn't do her PhD because it didn't fit in with the ideology. And I mean, this then becomes a kind of madness. And as I said, it's a witch hunt, and it's a kind of McCarthyism. And that I think that wherever you stand on this issue, whatever you are, I would really like some decent trans people now to speak up in support of Kathleen, because I know that they exist, and I know that not everybody wants to see women hounded out of jobs. They really, really don't. And what will it achieve? I mean, if any of this really made the lives of trans people better in any way, I would understand it. But the things that trans people need and want, they need much better healthcare. They need waiting lists to go down. They need all sorts of things that we all need that. But this is a kind of, I often feel it's a kind of proxy war. It's, you might not be able to change the world. You might not be able to do anything about climate change. It doesn't look like we're going to have a Labour government forever, but you can get a woman fired from a university. Hey, that's really big of you, Maybe that's really great. But the level of vitriol and actual nastiness involved in this is really shocking and awful. And again, I think that anyone interested in freedom of speech must come out and support Kathleen, whatever their views.
And the interesting thing about this one example, but also the many examples, is that the activists asking or demanding that these people are fired and removed from common humanity, basically, they claim they're the most righteous people who are sort of wanting the biggest, the most amount of progress, and they're sort of basically 21st century civil rights activists, and they paint you as a sort of reactionary, who's fighting against the forces of history. And I would argue that this is what you see with all radical ideologies, that they kind of paint themselves as righteous warriors and demean others as almost evil in a way. And one of the, this is kind of mixing two different debates here, but one of the interesting bits of language that came out of the Labour conference that caused such a row was the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Angela Raine. She described Conservatives as scum. I'm curious to think, what do you think about that comment? Are Conservatives scum?
I don't think it's exactly the right way to persuade your floating voters who you need to vote Labour if you ever want to, what is it? I think Labour needs something like 125 seats to turn to even be within a whisper of power. So it's this kind of, I think you use the word puritanism, puritanical idea that, that politics has become sort of a game of morality, and that you're a moral person, you think these things, there's a tick box of these things, you're an immoral person, and there's no model anymore of persuasion, of like possibly having a discussion where we might talk, we might compromise, we might change each other's minds. And it actually leaves the left really in a completely precarious position, which they already are, which I find really, really sad, because I think even lifelong Tories appreciate that there should be an opposition, and it's just it's a kind of craziness. But your point about civil rights, this being a new civil rights movement, and which sometimes people will say, it's the same as women's liberation, same as gay rights and stuff. And I say it isn't, because there has been no other civil rights movement that has demanded that other people give up their rights. So in the States, when people were marching and black people were wanting equality with white people, they weren't demanding that white people give up their rights. Gay people were not demanding that straight people give up their rights. Trans people some, again not all, are demanding that women can no longer have their single-sex spaces or their language, or and we see it more sort of visibly clearly in things like sports, or their own sports, So I think the idea, and I think Stonewall has been very good at promoting this idea, that it is just the new civil rights movement. It's exactly the same as the ones that came before it. It's just a new version of it. Is not true. And I think there's a lot of rewriting of history that's going on. I mean, people saying, "Oh, it's just like Section 28." Well, I was there. I fought that. I was there around AIDS activism. I know that this is different. But I'm continually being told that it's just the same. It's just history repeating itself. Nobody likes this marginalised minority, and it isn't the same. It just isn't. But back to Raine's comment. I just sort of wonder, really. I mean, just to be sort of pragmatic, I just wonder how people manage in their own families and their own lives, because don't we all have relatives that we politically disagree with, that we sit around the table with? Or do we say, no, you're scum, I'm sorry, you can't come for Christmas dinner because you're scum because you voted in a different way to me? And I mean, I think recently, in the last few years, we saw the result of talking about people like that, which was Brexit. So the Remain people who categorise all Leave people as thick, ignorant, racist scum, guess what? They didn't win them over. So, apart from it being rude or inappropriate or any of those things, it just doesn't work as a political strategy to actually believe that the people that you're trying to win an election against are evil. I hear it all the time. I think it's a sort of thing I probably said stuff like that when I was, 15. And I'm sure there are individual Tories that I really do not like. But I think that it's, she can't, to categorise everybody who votes Tory, especially, as we know, the last vote was lifelong Labour people switching. And these are the people that you've got to bring back, not call scum.
You mentioned Stonewall, which is a very, very good point, because it's been in the news recently because the BBC and other institutions, government departments and companies are starting to cut ties with the organisation because of its stance on all the things that we've been talking about. And I want to link this in as well with this Sussex story. If you're sort of on your side of the argument, you might say that both of those things are wins, and that people are beginning to fight back against this stuff. Do you see a sort of counter-revolutionary movement succeeding, or are we sort of doomed to fall to the trans activists?
I guess I feel that the more that people become a bit familiar with these arguments, I think the more they're kind of waking up to it. Yeah. And the poll that's always cited about actually, you know, all women really support this trans rights is really much more nuanced when you look at it, because yes, they do, I do. But when you ask then if somebody has not transitioned and i.e. had no surgery, basically retaining sort of male genitalia, and is in the changing room next to your 11-year-old daughter, are you happy about that? Then the reaction is a bit different, you know. So I think that there is again a confusion about, I mean, I certainly don't think that all trans people are predators at all. I mean, you know, that's also an extreme kind of way to think. But the risk for women in single-sex spaces, i.e. prisons, domestic refuges, women fleeing from domestic violence, they just have good reason not to want to be around somebody who may present as female but is in fact, you know, has male genitalia. I mean, we're always accused of being fixated on genitalia, but you know, this is a kind of reality, and I think people are understanding that a little bit more. And I think one of the areas where people are really seeing it is in, well, because it's so visible, is in things like sport. So when we had, you know, Laurel Hubbard weightlifting, who transitions very late apparently, and then takes the woman's place in the weightlifting competition, I think a lot of people were just, hang on a minute, this is just not, you know, they're not sort of motivated by any huge history of sexual politics. They're just like, hang on a minute, this isn't fair, this isn't right. And so I think, and the Sports Council here, hasn't it, have just come out with a whole sort of set of guidelines saying we are going to have to choose about what inclusivity is for trans people and what fairness is, and you know that these are really difficult choices. And some people suggest, both on both sides of the argument, that there will have to be a kind of third space for people, for trans people, either in whether it's in a prison or, you know, in sports or, yeah. So I do think that some bridges can be built, but I think they can only be built once we get to a point where people are a little bit more honest about what is really happening here. And I also think we have to understand that there tends to be a kind of misunderstanding that what happens in America is the same as what happens here, and here actually, you know, sex is a protected characteristic, and also I often feel that when I'm talking to American feminists, who many of whom I have huge respect for, but I do often feel a little bit like, get your own house in order, because actually, you know, American women in many places don't have maternity leave. We have the NHS. If somebody wants to transition here, that it takes, unfortunately, there's a very long waiting list, but it's free, and their healthcare and the hormones that they will need to be on for the rest of their lives are free. Yeah, in the States, everything is, you know, as we know, it's private. So I kind of slightly resent the idea that everything that happens in America, and Biden is going along with all this because his advisors are telling him to, you know, is all fantastic. And they just call Britain Turf Island because for some reason British women are just really uppity. Well, maybe we are uppity, but maybe we have a different history, and maybe, you know, that's not a bad thing. I mean, because I look at what's going on in Scotland, and most of it, you know, Sturgeon just pushing this stuff through. Again, many Scottish women are really, really unhappy, and I don't know how this is going to play for the average voter.
Let's talk about Labour to finish the interview, because Labour is losing elections. You know, it's the left-wing party in Britain. We've got a weak, I think, you know, we both agree we've got a pretty weak opposition at the moment. Boris Johnson seems to be in the ascendancy, despite a lot of problems that the country's facing. And they're describing their own voters or their potential voters as scum. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on the history of this. Interestingly, in 2009, I think it was, or 2010, Gordon Brown was caught on a hot mic calling someone a bigot, Gillian Duffy, who'd just spoken to him about her concerns to do with immigration, and I'm sure she probably voted for Brexit, and might be a Conservative voter now. How far does this history of perhaps despising your own voters or despising the Conservatives, how far does that go back?
In the Labour Party, oh God. There's no way that I could possibly put a date on it, but I do think that there's been how can I put this? I come from a working class family who voted Tory, and so I used to spend my entire adolescence, hating, probably calling my mum, and grandparents Tory scum, So, as I said, I get that, but I kind of grew out of that, which is because you do, but I think and I've always been around the left and sometimes the sort of hard left. I think there's a weird kind of taking for granted of the so-called working class, but also sort of despising it at the same time, and it's a really kind of untenable position, really, because also I don't know if you saw Sebastian Payne's new book about the broken heartlands. What's it, Broken Heartlands of England or something? Well, he travelled. He's from Northumbria. He travels to the seats that had always been Tory and then went Labour, and of course it's the traditional heartlands, the post-industrial parts of England that always voted Labour. It's just really patchy, and it just doesn't conform anymore to those sort of old-fashioned kind of Labour ideas about what the working class is. You have these commuter towns, say outside Durham and Newcastle, where people are identifying themselves as definitely aspirational and much more middle class, and probably don't even see themselves as working class. So Labour has a real issue here to understand what the new class politics are. And this may sound a bit odd, but I sort of think sometimes when I'm trying myself to just understand why for instance, this trans issue has become such an enormous issue when so many other big things are going on in the country, I think rather than really deal with the real fundamental changes in society, i.e., class structure, what COVID has done, whether there can ever be a coalition of voters that say the kind that, I'm not a Blairite, but the kind that Blair put together, whether that could ever happen again, rather than really, really grapple with these incredibly difficult things, let's just have a war about 1% of the population, the trans people, and let's pretend that's where all our activism must go. So I think there's a kind of avoidance of dealing with it. I think certain politicians say, somebody like Lisa Nandy, I don't agree with her on everything, but she was definitely, when she was standing for leadership, was saying, we've got to look at the small towns, we've got to look at the rural areas, because we've got this thing now, haven't we, where Labour just is big in sort of, it is the metropolitan elite that it was always accused of being. I think it was accused of being that before it kind of was, and now it appears almost that it is. Do
you think until Labour can get over this issue of talking to itself, you've just described very eloquently the problem they've got, until they start branching out and reaching out and understanding and sympathising with working class people and other people who used to vote Labour, until they get over this issue, can they ever win again? Are they sort of doomed?
Well, I certainly don't feel very optimistic for them at the moment, and I don't think that all the emphasis on, you know, Starmer, and is he charismatic or is he not? Well, he isn't, is he? Because I can't really work up any feelings about him. So I think you could have almost any leader and you'd still have these problems. I think the point at which it could possibly move is the day they give Andy Burnham a safe seat. If Burnham makes the move, I think that will be an indication that something is possibly going to change. And yet I can see why somebody like Andy Burnham is actually in a more powerful position where he is right now as a mayor of a big city, able to affect change, than he would be in the Labour Party in opposition. Do you know what I mean? So I don't, you know, what do they say? Events, dear boy, events. Anything could happen, couldn't it? And, you know, the Tories, something could go very badly wrong for them. I mean, things are going very badly wrong, but loads of things are going very, very badly wrong, but it isn't denting the polls because people just don't have this trust in Labour. And they no longer really understand what Labour represents or what it's for. And the whole idea of, you know, that Starmer's going to spell out the vision and all this. Well, there was a time when you could have asked the average person in the street, what do Tories represent, what do Labour represent? And, you know, as much as I don't like it, I have to say Johnson has taken quite a lot of ground from Labour positions. And certainly COVID, he probably didn't want to, but because of COVID, I mean, we've had the biggest amount of state intervention probably we've seen in our lifetime. So where Labour then has to work out a response to that, and it really hasn't yet. So yeah, they need a God. I mean, they don't just need a new leader; they need a complete reboot. And I think that they know it. I was watching. Have you seen the Blair Brown?
Yeah, I've seen the first episode. Yeah, it's very good though. Yeah.
Yeah, I was watching that the other day, and such mixed feelings about it, because what you saw there though was a real hunger to win. Whether you like Blair, whether you like Brown, that's irrelevant. And certainly Mandelson, you know, in the background, but they really wanted to win. When I'm with Labour people these days, I'm not sure if they want to win. And I think people sense that.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. That was fantastic.
Okay.